And Danny Moses, the optimist of the bunch, and a hell of a trader, which is the only reason they put up with his bullshit optimism.
Love you, bud. That's a weird call.
You take longer with a wrong number than anybody else.
It was this guy from Deutsche who was talking about shorting housing bonds.
You wanted to short housing bonds?
That happens like 5 times a day that somebody gets their own front point. We should change our name.
Hey, welcome back. My next guest is probably one of the most recognizable figures from the famous film The Big Short. Danny Moses is currently also a very long investor in the cannabis space. Danny, thanks for joining me today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Danny, for those who didn't see The Big Short, just give me an overview of the role you played in it.
So I guess the translation from the book to the movie was a little bit different. I was much more intense in the book. The book focused on, 8 to 10 people that Michael Lewis decided to focus on that were involved in shorting subprime bonds. And then from the book to the movie, basically took that to the big screen. Adam McKay obviously somehow was able to translate that book into a movie that people could understand. And in the movie, I was portrayed by an actor, Rafe Spall, who's a great guy. But I think from an intensity perspective, the book kind of gave a much better picture of my attitude during the crisis versus in the movie where I was looking for the next best restaurant where we were going to eat and so forth. So it was a lot of fun, and it certainly depicted us in an accurate manner in terms of our team. Once in a lifetime type trade and opportunity. So it was great. I have zero complaints.
Right. Okay, and so now tell me about your current role.
So getting out of the hedge fund business a couple of years ago, I decided that I would take a look at cannabis just as an investment opportunity. And me, like many other people who hadn't been involved in cannabis for the last 5 or 7 years, thought of cannabis opportunity as your friend from college or high school that moved to Colorado that decided to grow weed and sell it. And it really wasn't a real business, so to speak. And after I got over the kind of the stigma and obviously that ignorance that I had about the space, I started to realize that there's a lot of business opportunity here. There's health benefits, there's economic benefits, there was politically tailwinds in the space, and kind of teamed up with a group of people at Merida and kind of dipped my toe in, my ankle, my knee, now I'm pretty much up to my hip in this stuff. And so I found it to be an exciting, emerging space, and I don't think I've ever seen an opportunity like this from an investment perspective in my life. There's still a lot of hair on it, obviously. Still not federally legal. We all know that. I won't go over that on this show, obviously. But it's pretty exciting, and I've met a lot of interesting people along the way, people that have been working on it for more than 5 years, 10 years in some cases, and I think it's just incredible to watch the transformation.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So is Merida invested in primarily U.S. cannabis opportunities or Canadian and U.S. opportunities?
Mostly U.S. and mostly the ancillary stuff. So the packaging, the audit stuff, the compliance tools. It's a wide ranging. And now they have, they weren't touching the plant initially, and now they're touching the plant in various ways. Have a piece of a license in New York and other states as well. And there was just no way to kind of avoid it over a period of time. But what's really interesting about Merida is most of the investments in the portfolio, they have 2 different funds, are private. Some are actually public. And most of the public equities, at least until recently, are really private companies trading in a public vehicle that are either trading on the bulletin board or CSC or something of that area. And they don't have access to traditional capital. So companies like Merida have been able to supply that, and they're getting great terms for doing it as if the companies were actually private. But Mitch, who runs Merida, has a great way of kind of blending his entire portfolio together. So he'll cross-sell a lab testing company to a packager or to a grower. So there's a lot of beneficial interest within the portfolio, and watching that happen in real time is really interesting.
Sure, I bet. It's interesting that people seem to perceive the investment opportunity as more or less solely Canadian because of the federal prohibition in the United States, but you're telling me that as a hedge fund, I take it you're based in New York?
Well, I've worked with a fund that's in New York. I'm based in Westport, Connecticut. So, okay. And I'm not running a hedge fund, but I do have personal investments, obviously, in Merida and other companies in the space.
Okay, so how does the federal prohibition against marijuana in the United States affect what you can invest in, where you can invest, and the risk as a result of federal prohibition?
what's interesting, obviously, the biggest hurdle is the lack of access to the banking system. So obviously, everyone knows that the FDIC can't back a bank that's dealing in a federally prohibited substance. So because marijuana is a Schedule I drug, that obviously falls into that category. Therein lies the opportunity. If you're comfortable enough to make an investment in a company, and you're lending them, not just buying their stock, but you're actually lending them money in the private markets, you're going to get great terms because the access to capital is not there. So because it's federally banned, you're obviously taking a risk, both from your money and your reputation. But I think you get to a comfort level once you realize these are real companies with real revenues. Now, maybe some of the revenues are coming in the form of cash back from some of their customers. That's just an ongoing issue that should be resolved. But just imagine, even if you get the state protection laws coming in at some point, which Cory Gardner had proposed, the senator from Colorado, you would allow the banking system. Because right now it's credit unions and state chartered banks that are pretty much providing the capital and or private companies or individuals like myself. Imagine if that were to change just from a cost of capital perspective, what would happen to these companies' valuations? If you were actually able to, if banks could lend money in a traditional manner to these companies, what would happen to the present value of these companies? So I think the risk is worth the reward, or the reward is worth the risk, I should say, in these companies right now. But that being said, you got to be very selective. You have to really understand these companies. You got to read their 10Qs and 10Ks when you get them, talk to the managements, look at the corporate governance and so forth. So it's not just as easy as investing in cannabis and ignoring the federal laws. It's more of like, are these real companies with real revenues, real boards, real corporate governance to get you level of comfort to go in and invest. So I've invested in public Canadian equities, public U.S. companies, private U.S. companies. So pretty much run the gamut. And what's really interesting is in the last even 4 to 6 weeks, seeing a ton of deals in the technology space. People that are leaving the traditional Silicon Valley startups and coming into cannabis with that brain power and applying technology to the space. And that's really interesting to see because those are going to be higher multiple type companies because they don't really touch the plant at all. They cater to the industry. So a lot of moving parts here, but the irony is that the federal government ban is actually allowing, I think, kind of last influx of resources and capital to come into the space before it does make it mainstream. And I'm confident whether it's this midterm election that's coming up, that'll obviously be somewhat of a tailwind or something in the future, that the only way is to become legal in some form or fashion. So I'm pretty comfortable with that.
Sure. So what, from where you sit in the U.S., is the timeline to federal deprohibition in the U.S.?
It could come, we'll see what happens with the House and with the Senate, but barring those things, you have the Farm Bill coming, hopefully the first week in December, and if it gets extended, maybe it'll be early spring, so maybe it does not get done in a lame duck session, but it doesn't have to be a legalization. It can be a descheduling, as you know. It could be, I think, if you just get state protection laws coming in and protecting the economics of cannabis in those various states that have it, the 30 states that have some form of medical or rec or so forth, you will basically solve the issue, or that'll be a green light, so to speak. So it's going to be a work in progress. I don't think there's one answer or one particular bill that will solve it, but I think we should get a pretty good feel in the next kind of 6 weeks, both with the midterm elections, a lot of states, obviously a lot of ballot measures that are going forward, and then with the farming bill, which basically will legalize hemp and hemp-based CBD, which is an area that I'm very, very focused on, and so is Merida. So is the team of Merida. So a lot of exciting things will develop. I just don't see the genie going back in the bottle in this case. There's just too much money at stake now. We've seen the budget deficit. We've seen the estimates on a national basis, at least in the U.S. We're already seeing benefits locally where cannabis has been legalized and what it's doing for schools and budgets. And obviously, large U.S. companies like Consolidation Brands and Molson and these guys are investing in this product for a reason. And that's because they're seeing the markets where alcohol is being cannibalized, so to speak, by cannabis. They realize that there's a future here and they need to play offense, defense. And so dollars being poured in, you don't put $5 billion, $4.5 billion into a company if you're Constellation without a thorough, thoughtful plan. So those things, the horse has left the barn, and I've said this before, I think we're in the third inning, and whether it's some bill that passes, I don't see a fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh inning. I think we go straight to the eighth inning here in terms of capital, a wall of capital that people are just looking for an excuse. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there was a full-page ad taken out in the Wall Street Journal by a gentleman who was imploring the President of the United States to please deprohibit cannabis federally because he felt that the opportunity economically was being lost to the Canadian investment universe. How would you categorize that?
Well, I think that obviously the state of California alone is as big as Canada, if not bigger than Canada, obviously. So that goes without saying that there's a huge opportunity. I don't think yet that the U.S. is losing out. People aren't going up to Canada to get cannabis and bring it back. So I think it's more about what is the opportunity in front of us. And I totally agree. I don't think Trump really understands much, but maybe he can understand that 93% of Americans, approve medically legalized cannabis, and 63 to 65% and growing every day approve recreational for adult use. And so, like I said, I think it's a palatable, I think it checks a lot of boxes economically, from a health perspective, politically. And so, yes, the answer is U.S. should seize the moment. And, there's other countries that are obviously way ahead of the U.S., and we should be ahead of the pack. And the fact that Germany has built health laws that reimburse people for using cannabis, same in Canada you're seeing. So the whole formation of capital around that, the whole structure, is a positive, and the U.S. should pay attention and replicate it. And like I said before, the horse has left the barn, and it's just a matter of time. So the sooner the better, and the sooner that the government acknowledges it, so that the National Institute of Health can actually give money to research. We are seeing obviously medical benefits occurring. You don't just approve a drug, Epidiolex like that. Think about it. It works in epilepsy. So there's obviously medical benefits to this drug. So that's a whole nother category we could talk about, but I think that's going to be a very interesting trade on its own merit, just the health benefits. And big pharma companies know it, and and big tobacco companies know it, and you're going to start to see investments as soon as there's legalization of some form. We're going to keep seeing that. So again, there's a wall of capital waiting, and sooner the better that people have access to it. So.
How would you define the split in terms of the whole global opportunity in terms of medical relative to non-medical, recreational, other uses?
So I think that certainly I don't condone smoking in minors. I think it probably does have a detrimental effect on the brain. So let me just say that from the outset. I think that states' rights, 10th Amendment type stuff, should be given the right to legalize cannabis if they deem it for medical or recreational purposes. I think that we're learning that over the long period of time, alcohol is much more dangerous to the body. Cannabis, there's benefits there. So I'm indifferent on how states, I'm a liberal guy, I'm indifferent on how states want to see it. If it's not going to happen at the federal level, let the states decide what's best for the community, what the people that live in those local jurisdictions want. And so I just think it's done. I think there is a restorative justice aspect, though, that's really interesting. I'm sure you guys know, obviously, the history of how cannabis became a Schedule I drug in the first place. It was racist policies and so forth, and it was also back in the 30s, the fear that hemp itself could replace other industries. Timber industry, the lumber industries, you guys are well aware, hemp can be used in that. Construction, hemp can be used in that. Clothing, hemp can be used in that. So there was a lot of things that led to this Schedule I process. And so it would be great to see the United States take control of that. At the same time they want to legalize cannabis, I would implore these local jurisdictions to have ballot measures also that throw out felony convictions for people whose lives have been ruined because they had a joint on themselves in the 1970s and 80s. So there's a lot of moving parts here, but I think we can solve a lot of social issues and economic issues at the same time. That's probably a long-winded answer. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, you did. And finally, are there any companies in the U.S. that our sort of audience should be particularly focused on as sort of above the cut in terms of the rest of the landscape?
So obviously in recent weeks, we've seen several companies go public. The scarcity value for stocks both in Canada and the U.S. is somewhat disappearing. The ability to express this cannabis theme is expanding. I think that's one of the reasons we've had to sell off, not just to sell the news event on October 17th in Canada. I just think there's other alternatives to play. Most recently Curaleaf went public, and yeah, it got a $4 billion valuation, and sure, it traded down to $2.5 billion. I think right now it's back to a $3.5 billion valuation or something. I'm most interested in the smaller players in the U.S. So Liberty Health, I think, is a really interesting company that trades in the U.S. LHSIF. Obviously, it picks up in Canada as well, and they used to be a subsidiary of Aphria, as you guys are aware. I think it's the cheapest name. MPX, which is currently being processed to be acquired by Ianthus, that combined entity on a multiple basis is, so Liberty and the combination of Ianthus and MPX are much cheaper than what I'm seeing right now, both in the U.S. and in Canada. And I think what you're going to see is a continued consolidation among the large U.S. companies. So as these companies come public and they have currency to actually buy other companies, they're going to all try to vertically integrate themselves into these states because they have to validate these very high valuations. So I think the mom and pop one-off dispensaries, growers in these various states, whether you're looking at Massachusetts or Maryland or Florida, California, are going to consolidate. So you want to own the bigger companies that you can. At the same time, from a valuation perspective, MPX, Liberty, and Ianthus are my top. And then also on the ancillary side, I think Kush Bottles is extremely interesting. About a $400 million company. They do packaging. They now do gas delivery for extraction, and they are literally in the middle of everything. They do everything but touch the plant. And it's a $400 million company that trades OTC, and I think it's very interesting. That's KSH. Sorry, now it's known as Kush Co. They just rebranded the company. So those are the kind of the names that I think are most interesting right now.
Okay, Danny, that's great. I appreciate your participation. We'd like to come back to you in a short period of time and see how you're doing. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.